Howdy over you delicious people. I'm here today to review the movie Mindgamers. So, I had reviewed this movie on my other channel, and I don't know, like, bizarrely, it just did really well. So, I don't know what it was. More than likely, people might just like tech movies. People might just, have found this movie to be interesting, or maybe just people like really didn't like this movie and so they hung on to it. I don't know. Um, I just really saw how this movie was doing really well, and so I decided to re-review it here. Because like I'm pretty much just gutted all the reviews that I ever had on the other channel, to just have everything fresh and new being done here, which I just kind of just thought that was just a good thing to do, but I could be wrong. But who knows? But anyways, so Mind Gamers. So going at this the second time around, I think the first time I judged this movie like really harshly. I was like somebody had to be like smoking some weed and whatever during this movie, and it's ridiculous, whatever. Like, I think really watching this movie now, this movie isn't anything that really and truly gets exciting within this movie, and plus it just kind of ends bizarrely. Uh, but with that to be said, like, I think of, like, there's some people that might just like the technological side of a movie. Like, it might tweak their brain a little bit to hear like technical jargons and stuff along those lines, because they might be a higher thinking person, or maybe they just like to uh, see a movie that just is like has more technology base than any other movie, and so that might be a reason why people might enjoy this movie, just because of hearing technological stuff that they wouldn't hear in other movies. Or some people might be a scientist like person and like the fact that they are testing things in this movie. They are trying to figure out some puzzle, and hopefully they will solve this by the end of this movie. Going on here, like, the way of which that this concept ends up going is, we have a priest who ends up giving up on his priesthood to decide to go into science and be a scientist. And we end up having this scientist wanting to ask other scientists to be a part of this study, this of this thing called an Enox. And so we eventually have it to where this experiment ends up eventually, after X amount of time, but it seems to eventually show some kind of fruit, because I think there is a presence that these people are unaware of that eventually is going to force them into success, which eventually forces people to really start to, I think, eventually get fairly burnt out within this experiment, or are just seeing something a certain way. Like, we have it to where there is one girl within this movie who is all of a sudden starting to read scriptures and watch a television-esh like persona that is talking about technology, and like he's preaching about it. Like, as if he's the technological preacher of sorts that is going to tell you, well, hey, if there's anybody that isn't putting ones and zeros correctly, like, get rid of them, like, judge them, smite them, whatever. Like, he's doing it in a very preacher-esh like way. We also have it to where there seems to be a girl that is seemingly so smart that eventually things end up working out for that character the way it ends up working out, let's just say cryptically in this movie. But again, we eventually also have some new entity that comes into the fray that ends up kind of making this experiment work out, and justifiably, we'll figure out why towards the very tail end of whatever this movie is, to showcase who this person is when eventually we get there. With that said, the only thing that is kind of really interesting going on within this movie is parkour and dancing. And then there is a little tiny action sequence. But that's about it. Everything else is scientific. Everything else is really for people that are interested in a technological movie, then this is for them. If anything, a lot of this stuff kind of went over my head because I'm really not that high of thinking of a person. But with that said, that doesn't mean that I can't try and break this movie down and talk about it and review it somehow. So with that said, I think let's get into Mindgamers, because I've kind of haltered off as long as I could with talking about this movie in a cryptic-like sense. So let's get into a spoiler-like sense. More than likely, I'm going to probably talk about this movie as generically as possible, so if people want to go into the comments section and whatever, talk about this movie in more detail, talk about how they felt about the movie, go ahead. Some people might like this review better compared to the other one, where I was talking and saying that, yeah, like, somebody's on weed when they did this movie, whoo, yeah! Just... And somebody still might have that same opinion, and that's perfectly fine. That more than likely they might have sided with me in the first review compared to this one. And that's perfectly fine too. Maybe I went more relaxed in this review than before. So anyways, let's go into that double 5 time territory and bust out the otherwise spoiler time. This is a weird movie at the end of the day, so I just wanted to say that, we're gonna re-review this because I've already reviewed this before. So let's get into spoiler time. So we have all this like technology movie. That's all of what this really is. So I'm gonna get to the real nitty and gritty of this movie. So we end up having a guy named Krunz. I'm still trying to forcibly figure out how exactly that name is pronounced, because I don't really care about the way it's probably pronounced in the movie, because I'm not going to rewatch a movie just for a name of something. So we have Krunz, Sam Neill's character, the guy who, of course, was in Jurassic Park, and some people might even know him from movies like Event Horizon, or I think he did a Bermuda Triangle movie at one point. I don't know why. But anyways, we have Sam Neill, who is playing this priest who had given up his faith to be a scientist. And so we have it to where Krunz is to showcase that he is wearing a mask at all times, even before masks were cool, I guess. And because we end up finding out that Krunz, whatever, I'm going to go with Sam Neill. It's a lot easier. Sam Neill is wearing a mask over his face because we end up finding out that this guy had a heart attack, which was to lead him to have a kind of off-to-the-side face, or whichever you want to call it. So we have this guy who is doing a PowerPoint presentation to all these students to just say, like, hey guys, if you're really, really smart, and you can go and want to be a part of this scientific discovery called this thing called Enox, which I guess was named after some technological god, we end up having Sam Neill begging these students, like, hey, if you're smart enough, like, be a part of my experiment. and also, like, you're going to get paid basically for doing that as well. So we end up having it to where Sam Neill is mentioning that he's not a god, but he thinks that he's created one with this Enoch's like character, or this Enoch's like machine thing. So we end up having a bunch of people that are all um, I would call them like applying for this experiment, and we end up having, of course, Tom Paine, who is actually some people might have seen him recently in Prodigal Son, or some people might have also seen him in Walking Dead as Jesus. We have him to where he's kind of the ringleader of these experimental people. Like, some people might have like some bits and pieces to help this experiment out, but I think Jackson is the like leader of this whole thing, really, in all, because he's consistently like being the controller of things. So we have Jackson, who is doing this interview, mentioning about how far he's willing to go to be a part of this experiment. We end up finding that Tom Paine has information on an experiment that is showcasing how there's an experiment done where some guy has to forcibly put a gun to his head and pull the trigger, but there's not an actual like bullet in there. But like the experiment was to showcase that this guy had no full will to be able to stop this gun from going to his head, and so that's what they're trying to figure out and try to engineer and try to figure out how to uh, like solve the riddle of how to have this person like control their body or have someone else control their body, and so on and so forth. So eventually they end up kind of throwing everything into the thing together, and it ends up working out towards the end here, and I'll explain that. So we end up having Jackson talking about some of the other candidates, talking about, I believe his name is Dylan, who's a very much more like emo kind of guy who has like nipple rings and all kinds of things. We have Maddie, who we eventually will find out will be the girl that is going to start reading a technological book of sorts, and eventually start watching a technology preacher that is going to tell her about all kinds of things. She's going to start believing it up to absurd levels, to where eventually she's going to go and smite some people that she thinks is doing wrong. And so we have Agnes, who is a part of this experiment, but she won't be on for very long, let's just say. We have Rollo, who seems to be a guy of large descent, and it seems that he is a guy that is kind of putting stuff together to help out this experiment, and then eventually we have it to where both Rollo and Dylan end up actually doing something fairly interesting in this experiment, which was to lead them to figure out that they have this ability now to do something that somebody else has done, just because they have the brain wave knowledge of something. Like, a lot of this movie ties into brain waves, and it's kind of interesting. But then again, like, it doesn't have a like, it just kind of like goes to a point to where it goes off to not really doing enough of anything with that kind of ability. Like, we have it to where, like, it would have been cool if all of a sudden, like, with people having this technology and whatever, like, it would have been really interesting if everybody would have just started like controlling either one another, just to like, well, hey, like, I want this person to die because like they're gonna get a lot of chunk of my money. So like it could have been this whole like paranoia thing where where people were killing people off by controlling their own brains but it didn't go that way at all. It didn't really go into that juncture. So anybody else that I probably forgot about? So we go along and we have it to where we have Jackson, who is doing some experiments on a paralyzed character called Voltaire, and they are trying to get it to where his body can be able to move, because of course his body cannot move. And so we end up having to where Jackson is consistently trying to do experiments on rats to try and figure out how this experiment can work. And so while that is going on, we end up having a character called Agnes who is like overthinking life and the world around her so much so that she is equating her way out of her own life. Meaning, like, this girl is thinking that, like, okay, well, if I'm factor X, factor X doesn't need to exist anymore, and blah, blah, blah. Like, she's going through all these equations and figuring out that her life is meaningless. So we have Agnes, who is consistently, I guess, on some kind of drugs, to where eventually we end up having Agnes at this Halloween party dressed as an angel, going to walking off of a building to then jump off, because she is realizing how equation wise that her life does not matter. And so we end up having Jackson and all the rest of the experimenters all going after and trying to find Agnes to see where she had went. And eventually we have Jackson, who ends up seeing Agnes on the rooftop of this building, and he tries to get to her, but sadly it is too late. So we end up having them trying to grieve during this time period. And while they are doing that, we have this woman called Stella that is quite, in all actuality, just making her way into this experiment. She's basically just saying, like, well, like, I'm going to be the person that's going to be part of this experiment, whether anybody wants it or not. We end up having Stella talking to Krunst or Sam Neill at some point during the time of when Sam Neill was talking about this experiment, and she was butting in and mentioning some things and how that they shouldn't really be doing this, and how she was kind of protesting it or whatever. So whichever. So we end up finding out that Stella had kind of forced her way into this experiment, and she had actually gotten a lot further than anyone else had gone with this experiment, just because she stole information from some of the guys, and she furthered along this experiment to where we end up finding out that Stella is to have gone with a bunch of these guys that are all parkour people, and she has linked with their brain using their all their tag things that each one of them all get when they have to be put into this lab. They're all connected via this tag link that's on their neck. And so we end up finding out that Stella has figured out a way to brain wavelength with a guy that can do parkour, and now Stella has figured out how to be able to do the exact same parkour moves, to where we have Voltaire, who is kind of a little bit ticked off because, like, wait a minute, like, she stole every single one of my moves. How is it that she can steal every single one of my moves? And we have it to where Stella is like, well, because I'm brainwave linked with Voltaire. That's how I figured out how to be able to do his parkour moves. And the more that Voltaire is linked with somebody that has this neck thing on, we end up finding out that Voltaire is able to move his finger to where he can say, like, eventually, like, dude, I'm just I'm just a brief point away from a hand job. So we end up finding out that the more people that are linked with Voltaire, the more that he can start moving his body. And so we have it to where Rollo and Dylan experiment on the ability of having the brainwaves of Voltaire. And so we end up having Rollo and Dylan just going out and doing all these parkour moves and all these, like, jumps and flips and whatever and all kinds of things to showcase that this experiment really works, but then to also have them have their fun. And so we end up escalating this to have Voltaire, like, trying to get as many friends as he knows as humanly possible, and we end up having all the scientists all trying to get as many people together as humanly possible in one room, compact them all with these things on their neck, so that way they could eventually help some people that have had problems. Like, they could help Sam Neill eventually, his character, fix his face to where he could be able to move the whole half of his entire body. We could eventually have Voltaire eventually go and be able to dance and whatever, like everyone else can, and so on and so forth. Because eventually we have it to where everybody compacts himself into this one room, and they all in utter sequence, like, at first they're just kind of like shimmying around and whatever, but eventually they all start dancing all in unison, with Jackson taking off his neck thing and being the controlled substance that's going to control people so he's going to control everyone. So we end up having it to where Jackson is controlling all of these people, but we also end up finding out that this Stella girl is more than what she's to lead on to be. And so we end up finding that that Maddie is going to seek revenge on all of these scientists and all these experimenters and all these whatever, because she feels like this experiment is going against God. And so she goes with a baseball bat to kill off every single person that was dancing in this dancing room, to where we just see the onslaught of all these people just dying off by this girl with this baseball bat. And I'm just like, okay, this is just odd. So we end up pushing on to eventually find out that that Stella had really put this experiment together because she is actually the technology god known as Enox, And so eventually we have it to where Stella makes her way to the machine known as Enox, and Sam Neill ends up following her, or following him. Sam Neill ends up following Stella to the Enox machine, and we end up having uh, Stella mentioning to, or Sam Neill eventually figures out that Stella is actually Enox, and he eventually ends up uh, trying to prevent Stella from falling into the machine Enox, and he ends up bizarrely, because the room like weirdly just starts to become very cold to the point of him almost freezing at some point where he like stops trying to retrieve her. And so we end up seeing a flashback of sorts of it seemingly being where we are to assess and or assume that Sam Neill had to have taken quite possibly a different route uh, to lead him to not have a heart attack, or maybe this is some alternate universe, alternate world, whichever, where Sam Neill is talking about this experiment again, um, and talking, or not quite talking about Enox, but talking about two sides of a brain. And he seems to be much younger than he was. Uh, so, uh, interestingly enough, we must have had Sam Neill in this different world take a different route than what he was before. Because we end up finding out, I think the original Sam Neill had gotten a heart attack from being in bed with a woman, and that had caused him to have some heart attack, but I guess had also caused him to, I guess, be able to also come up with Enox, I would assess or assume. So we end up having Sam Neill talking about a certain side of the brain, talking about one side being the ego and one side being the kind of undefined side, of course, and so on and so forth. So we have it to where Stella is going on to this proceeding. She's somewhere in the back, but then she ends up walking off. We bizarrely see Jackson, who is uh, in this room, and he kind of looks back on her, and he ends up like following her, and that is to lead him and her. We end up finding that Stella goes back into this Enox machine, and that's just the way the movie ends. With her falling into the Enox machine, and I guess she is a person that is trying to put right what once went wrong. Like, to where she is correcting with her power anybody that is going to get to have way too much technological power, and so she uh, ends up destroying this world of which, uh, like, she ends up trying to prevent these people from having way too far of power, and so she comes to correct, I guess, this thing happening, to where that's when we have a completely different world, to where Stella has realized that her work is done, and then she goes back into her machine to eventually go on to uh, try and, I guess, prevent the next technological advancement that is way too far beyond anybody. So, with that said, I think there might have been something here and there that I might have just like thought about and probably wasn't exactly accurate within this movie. There was some stuff that I kind of made my own consensuses and really anybody could make different consensuses or different decisions about this movie about why things went the way they did. Like at some point, we had Sam Neill, who had uh, been a priest and was on a rooftop with Stella, and Stella was slowly but surely teetering off of that statue in this movie. And so I'm assessing that Sam Neill had probably in his past saved Stella before, which led him to give up on his faith to be a scientist, which led him to eventually coming up with Enox. Whereas maybe in the past, maybe Sam Neill had let Stella go and decided to become a scientist in a different way, and so on and so like. There's a lot of flashbacks and there's a lot of kind of mixing of scenes that doesn't exactly quite 100% make sense to me. But I think there could be a lot of people that could say, like, well, yeah, you read this scene wrong, and, like, this is what actually happened, and so on and so forth. Because there might have been a dialogue here or there, probably through a bulk of this movie, that I probably missed out on, because a lot of it was probably just like, because a lot of it was just like technological things that kind of went beyond my head. There was at one point we end up having Sam Neill with a assistant character, who I think was just called the Assessor, where like I thought that this character was really interesting because he like really wanted like one, he was kind of like giving crap on Jackson when it's like, dude, like we've been doing this for 2 years. Eventually, this experiment needs to show fruit, and eventually we have it to where the successor eventually goes to when this party ends up going horribly awry, and one renegade person ends up making her way through this experiment with a baseball bat. We eventually have it to where the assessor ends up grabbing some woman, and both and Jackson has to go and save this woman by taking a pipe onto the assessor and end up killing him, and so on and so forth. There's a lot about this movie that like I'll probably need to rewatch again and just be like, what the heck was any of this? Like I never like to me probably a lot of the dialogue was just completely missed over my head for the most point, just because a lot of it was so like sciencey words. Okay. Like we have a tour, like I got like the parts where there wasn't much dialogue, but anything beyond the dialogue was just for the most point. So with that said, I think I am going to get out of here. If people are gonna watch this for the first time, it's a weird movie. For people who had watched this for the first time, because unless you're just going in here just to hear my voice, which is perfectly fine, because I appreciate that. This is an odd movie. And so at the end of the day, I appreciate that this movie was a good review for some people. But if there's some people that still didn't like this after the second time around that they've seen this, or maybe they were reminded that they've seen this movie and how bad it was, because I think a lot of people would have just been like, man, that was a horrible movie, and it kind of really, like, this time around I really went soft on it, just because like I didn't think that this movie had a real point of being put together. It was a bunch of sciencey stuff that I think really at the end of the day somebody wanted to have this be a very vastly different movie. I think with a movie titled Mindgamers, people are just like, oh, well, this is like a VR movie, and it's not that at all. Like, there is a little bit of a guy doing some VR thing. But that's about it, and I don't even quite understand why he even did that in this movie. But with that said, I am going to get out of here. Bye, everybody. Bye, everybody.